Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the U.S. Carbon Tetrachloride Risk Evaluation and Risk Management Conference Call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. If you require further assistance, please press *0. I would now like to hand the conference over to your first speaker today, Mr. Brian Sims. Sir, please go ahead.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone, and good morning to those of you further west. It's a pleasure for us to be here today to have this dialogue with you all. As noted, my name is Brian Sims, and I'm the Acting Director of the Existing Chemicals Risk Management Division within the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics at EPA. I'm opening today's webinar to emphasize how much we value your input. It's a useful forum for the agency to obtain public comment on the implementation of TSCA and our risk management of carbon tetrachloride in particular. Before I turn it over to my colleague Claudia, who is going to walk through a presentation telling you more details about our work on carbon tet, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. With the amendments to TSCA that were enacted in 2016, we've essentially been building a new regulatory program from the ground up. We've taken some big steps in that process over the past several months by issuing several risk evaluations. This is the fourth risk evaluation that we've released of ultimately 10 that will be released. In this risk evaluation, we've identified unreasonable risks for workers and occupational non-users. Now we're taking the next step in that process by moving to the risk management phase. When unreasonable risks are identified, TSCA requires the agency to undertake a rulemaking process to address unreasonable risks. Wanted you to be aware of this work that's ongoing, and through meetings like today's, help us do the risk management rulemakings under TSCA by providing your input and providing information that will help us throughout that process. So we're going to be using today to bring you up to speed on some of the key provisions of TSCA. For those of you who have been in previous meetings on other chemicals, you'll be hearing some of the same information that you did hear in those sessions as well. In terms of how those provisions relate to risk management requirements, but in particular, we want to inform you about the unreasonable risk findings for carbon tet and outline the next steps in that process. Perhaps most importantly, throughout this process, we'll be seeking input from you on our potential risk management approaches, their effectiveness, and any impacts those approaches might have on you, our stakeholders. Your feedback is important as we develop the regulations to ensure they're practical and protective. So this is a critical juncture for public involvement in this process. We need and truly appreciate your input, your expertise, and your feedback now at this stage in the process that'll help shape the ways we're going to address the unreasonable risks that we found. So now you're going to hear more from Claudia about how you can get in touch and get involved, in addition to all the information she's going to be providing on our work on carbon tet. So thank you once again for joining us today, and on behalf of the agency and our office, we certainly look forward to working with you as this process moves forward. So thank you very much. Claudia?
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. I'm Claudia Minash, and I'm the point of contact for the risk management of carbon tetrachloride. And as Brian mentioned, I'll be presenting an overview of the carbon tetrachloride risk evaluation and the next steps for risk management. We're looking forward to your comments. Next slide. These are the topics we'll be covering during this presentation. I will provide you with a background on the risk evaluation process, the unreasonable risk findings, the risk management requirements under TSCA, and then I'll talk about the type of information that we'll use during risk management, the principles of transparency during the risk management process, and where to find additional information. And again, some of the risk management information is very similar to the information presented during the public webinars for the previous chemicals. Next slide. TSCA requires EPA to evaluate the manufacturing, including import, processing, distribution and commerce, use, and disposal of existing chemical substances and identify those conditions of use which present unreasonable risk to health or the environment. The evaluation should be done without consideration of costs or other non-risk factors. It should include unreasonable risk to potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations relevant to the risk evaluation. TSCA requires completion of the risk evaluation process within 3 to 3.5 years. Next slide. This is a diagram illustrating the risk evaluation process and the timeline. Carbon tetrachloride was one of the first 10 chemicals and was not subject to prioritization. The risk evaluation of carbon tet was completed and includes a determination of which conditions of use present unreasonable risk. We are now in the risk management action steps at the bottom of the slide for those conditions of use with unreasonable risk. Next slide, please. The final risk evaluation of carbon tet was published on November 3rd of last month. It evaluated 15 conditions of use for carbon tet, and it followed a process that included the publication of a draft risk evaluation, a problem formulation, and a scope document. Public comments were received throughout the process. The draft risk evaluation received 19 public comments and was peer-reviewed by the Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals in February of this year. Information regarding the final risk evaluation and additional materials can be found in the dockets listed on the slide. Next slide. This slide provides some general information on carbon tet. Carbon tet is a colorless liquid and a volatile organic chemical. It is both produced in and imported into the United States. It is mostly used as a solvent, intermediate, processing aid, or additive in the manufacturing of other chemicals. It is used as a reactant in the production of HCFCs, HFCs, HFOs, and perfluoroethylene, as well as in other organic and inorganic chemical manufacturing. Other conditions of use identified by EPA include distribution in commerce and disposal of carbon tet. The total production was between 100 and 250 million pounds in 2015. Next slide. This slide shows the life cycle diagram for carbon tet. It is taken directly from the risk evaluation and illustrates the different conditions of use identified and evaluated by EPA. Next slide. As a result of the risk evaluation, EPA determined that carbon tet does not present unreasonable risk to the environment. EPA determined that 2 out of the 15 conditions of use do not present unreasonable risk. These are reactive ion etching and distribution in commerce. This determination is considered a final agency action, and the risk evaluation is the order required by TSCA. Next slide. EPA found that 13 out of the 15 conditions of use evaluated presented unreasonable risk to workers and occupational non-users. The unreasonable risk determinations were based off of cancer and non-cancer, specifically liver toxicity, effects from chronic inhalation and dermal exposures to carbon tet. Next slide. The conditions of use that present unreasonable risk are listed here. As you can see, it includes manufacturing, import, most processing uses, industrial and commercial uses, and disposal. Next slide. As mentioned previously, the unreasonable risks were determined to be to workers and to occupational non-users. For workers, the unreasonable risks were cancer from dermal exposures. For occupational non-users, the unreasonable risks were cancer and liver toxicity from chronic inhalation exposures. The OSHA PEL for carbon tet is 10 parts per million. Many of the conditions of use presented unreasonable risk to workers, even with the use of gloves with a PF of 20. EPA found that there was no unreasonable risk to workers from acute and chronic inhalation exposures, assuming use of respirators with an APF of 50. EPA also did not assume that occupational non-users use PPE because they do not handle the chemical. Next slide. Here is an outline of the risk management requirements under TSCA. Now that EPA has determined which conditions of use present unreasonable risk, the agency is required to take action so that carbon PET no longer presents unreasonable risk. EPA should propose a rule a year after the risk evaluation is completed and a final rule 2 years after the risk evaluation is completed. There are other requirements, including the consideration of of alternatives when selecting certain risk management options and a statement of effects. Of course, it is critical that we have stakeholder involvement during the development of the rulemaking. Next slide. Here is the list of requirements provided by TSCA Section 6A to address the unreasonable risk. These include prohibiting, limiting, or restricting the manufacturing, processing, distribution and commerce, commercial use, or disposal. EPA could also require record keeping, monitoring, or testing. While the list seems limited, there are many tools under each of these regulatory options that could be used to address the unreasonable risk. Next slide. Section 6A provides authority to regulate distributors, manufacturers, and processors, or those making products that contain carbon PET, commercial uses, and entities disposing of carbon PET. Next slide. The regulatory authority provided by TSCA Section 6A can be used in several different ways, and this provides a variety of tools for risk management. Some examples are creating a label that attaches to a product with specific instructions and precautions. We could prohibit importing, processing, and distribution of specific conditions of use. We could mandate specific engineering controls, such as ventilation requirements and PPE at occupational sites. We could require downstream notification, or we can set an occupational air exposure limit, also known as an ECL. Next slide. EPA could require monitoring of exposures in occupational settings. We could also mandate administrative controls and system requirements at occupational sites. We could mandate a training program at occupational sites, or the agency could require a hazard communication program to educate workers. Next slide. As mentioned before, in addition to the requirements to address unreasonable risk, EPA is also required under Section 6B of TSCA to consider and publish a statement with respect to the effects and magnitude of exposure to human health and the environment, the benefits of the various uses of the chemical, and the economic consequences of the rule, including effects on the national economy, small businesses, technological innovation, the environment, and public health, as well as the cost and benefits and cost effectiveness of the proposed regulatory action and of regulatory alternatives. Next slide, please. This slide lists the executive orders relevant to Section 6A rulemaking, and in addition to TSCA, EPA also needs to address these executive orders in the rulemaking process. Next slide. As we move forward with the identification of risk management options, we would welcome information regarding effective methods to address unreasonable risk, your views regarding the regulatory approaches, current work practices to control exposures, such as engineering and administrative controls, information on essential uses and impacts if carbon PET is not available, identification of uses that have been phased out or are no longer needed, information on substitute chemicals and safer and effective alternatives, and how EPA can improve the regulatory process or be more transparent. Next slide. Here's a summary of EPA's principles of transparency during the risk management process. EPA is seeking transparent, proactive, and meaningful engagement with stakeholders. We are conducting one-on-one meetings, webinars, and formal consultations with state and local governments, tribes, environmental justice communities, and small businesses. The goal of this dialogue is to explain the risk evaluation findings, the risk management required by TSCA, and the options available to EPA to manage the unreasonable risk. We want to learn from stakeholders about the effectiveness of the different risk management approaches and their potential impacts on businesses and workers. And of course, with stakeholder input, we could develop regulations that are practical and protective. Next slide. The coordination and engagement during the development of risk management approaches consists of consultations with stakeholders regarding possible risk management solutions, such as engineering controls, PPE, and available alternatives, or other effective solutions. If invited by companies, we could conduct site visits to learn more of existing practices. And of course, developing a network of stakeholders, we could ensure that regulatory approaches are fully informed and based on current conditions. Next slide. This slide presents some opportunities for involvement. As I mentioned, we'll be conducting one-on-one meetings, and please let us know if you are interested in meeting with us. We look forward to hearing your comments during this webinar, and we'll also be doing similar public webinars for other chemicals following their risk evaluation. As I mentioned previously, we'll have formal consultations with state and local governments, tribes, small businesses, and environmental justice organizations and communities. Please let us know if you are interested. Next slide. This slide has a link to web pages and additional information regarding TSCA and the risk management activities. It also has contact information if you would like to get in touch with us. Please feel free to email me, Claudia Minash, to schedule a meeting. My colleague Doug Parsons is also available to coordinate outreach and engagement if you are interested in meeting with us. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Hello, my name is Sarah Cox. A lot of you have probably received emails from me in the past. I work with Claudia in working with these chemicals. Right now, we are having our opportunity for public comments. There was an option to sign up to make a public comment. So if you are one of the people that has signed up for that, I am going to have our operator come on and give you instructions on how you can call in to be put in the queue for those public comments. Operator, can you please give those instructions now?
Certainly. If you want to make a comment, please press star then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that's star then the number 1 on your telephone keypad.
And we will give a few minutes for those people to get in the phone queue.
Mr. Jonathan Palmas, your line is open.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you are good to go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm John Kelmus-Katz, a staff attorney with Earth Justice's Toxic Exposures and Health Program. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. In our comments on the carbon tetrachloride risk evaluation, we identified multiple areas where EPA had ignored or understated the serious risks posed by carbon tetrachloride. Today, I want to urge EPA not to make those same mistakes in the risk management process. TSCA Section 6A requires EPA to regulate carbon tetrachloride to the extent necessary so that the chemical substance no longer presents unreasonable risk. This means that, at a minimum, EPA must eliminate the unreasonable risks identified in its risk evaluation. In deciding how to eliminate those risks, TSCA Section 6C requires EPA to consider the effects of the chemical on human health and the environment, as well as the benefits of different regulatory options. TSCA does not limit those risk management considerations to the effects and benefits that were quantified in the risk evaluation, or permit EPA to ignore known risks associated with carbon tetrachloride's conditions of use, merely because EPA failed to consider them previously. For example, carbon tetrachloride is a potent ozone-depleting chemical, which is responsible for nearly 10% of the ozone-destroying chlorine in the Earth's inner atmosphere. Carbon tetrachloride's depletion of the ozone layer places the public at greater risk of skin cancer, cataracts, and other serious injuries. Yet EPA did not consider those ozone-depleting effects in its carbon tetrachloride risk evaluation. When deciding how to regulate the conditions of use for which EPA did find unreasonable risk, EPA must consider how different regulatory options would affect the recovery or depletion of the ozone layer and the resulting impacts on human health and the environment. Similarly, hundreds of thousands of pounds of carbon tetrachloride are emitted into the air each year. In 2019, the two largest emitters of carbon tetrachloride were both located in Geismar, Louisiana, a community located in an area known as Cancer Alley due to the proliferation of chemical manufacturers, refineries, and other industrial facilities. Geismar is an environmental justice community with some of the worst air quality in the nation, according to EPA's Air Toxic Cancer Risk Assessment and Respiratory Hazard Index. However, EPA did not consider the risks to the residents of Geismar or to any other frontline communities in the carbon tetrachloride risk evaluation. When selecting a risk management plan, EPA is required to eliminate risks to potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, including communities like Geismar that are exposed to greater amounts of carbon tetrachloride and thus to greater risks than the general public. In addition, EPA has detected elevated levels of carbon tetrachloride in ambient air nationwide, as described in the National Air Toxics Assessment. EPA cannot ensure that its risk management rules will eliminate unreasonable risk if it does not take into account the exposures that workers, consumers, and the general population face from those background air concentrations. Risk management presents a new chance for EPA. It's a process guided by EPA's risk evaluations, but not limited by them. We urge EPA to embrace this opportunity to move beyond the past administration's flawed interpretations of TSCA and to comprehensively regulate all of carbon tetrachloride's unreasonable risks. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate your comment.
All right, at this time, go ahead, operator.
Once again, if anyone wants to make a comment, please press star then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. There are no further comments at this time, presenters.
Okay, so at this time, if we have some time left over, so if there's anyone that was not registered to make a comment but would like to make a comment at this time, feel free to call in. If you need the number is in the notes section on the top of the screen there. And when you call in, you can press star 1, and we have some time to take some comments. We will give it a few minutes for anyone that wants to dial in. Okay, well, it looks like no one has any comments that they would like to make at this time. As always, we are very happy to speak with anyone when they would like. There's some contact information right up there, as well as some links with some more information. The slides will be posted as well. That was one question that we got. We'll give it another few seconds. If anyone has a question, feel free to type in the chat box. And if not, then we thank you very much for coming. We appreciate all of your input, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's conference call. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.